Welcome to the House of Hypertrophy. What's the best training modality for hypertrophy? Some speculate free weights, like barbells or dumbbells, are superior since they produce greater temporary increases in anabolic hormones after training. In fact, others might suppose dumbbells are the optimal modality since they enable greater freedom of movement. Others might suggest machines are superior as they can help you isolate a specific muscle, or because some machines provide variable resistance or even eccentric overload. With bodyweight or resistance bands, it's rare to hear people believing these are superior for muscle hypertrophy. Instead, some might actually believe these are terrible for building muscle. In this video, we'll thoroughly examine the research on how barbells, dumbbells, machines, bodyweight, and resistance bands compare for muscle hypertrophy. Let's dive in. We have an in-depth video dissecting the literature on the stimuli behind muscle hypertrophy. Mechanical tension is likely the primary hypertrophy stimulus. Other hypothesized stimuli like muscle damage and metabolic stress simply don't have strong evidence they are powerful drivers of hypertrophy. We thoroughly described mechanical tension previously, but if you haven't seen it, all you need to know for this video is that mechanical tension is the force produced by the fibers of a muscle. Within and around muscle fibers are mechanosensors that can detect forces and convert the forces into a signaling cascade that produces muscle hypertrophy. How do we achieve high mechanical tension, and how does this tie into different training modalities? The basic initial step is we want to use a movement that recruits a muscle, and it appears the nervous system recruits muscles based on their leverage for a given movement. This is called neuromechanical matching. Think of leverage as how easily a muscle can produce force for a given movement. For example, the biceps have significant leverage for flexing the elbow joint. So elbow flexion will recruit the biceps. Elbow flexion can occur with barbells, dumbbells, machines, bodyweight, and resistance bands. In other words, no training modality has an inherent advantage for initiating the recruitment of a muscle. The specific movement, not training modality, is what results in a muscle's recruitment. Now, certain training modalities might be better for carrying out a certain movement. We'll return to this point later, but the main point is no training modality has a unanimous advantage for initiating the recruitment of a muscle. Now, simply initiating the recruitment of a muscle doesn't mean we're exposing that recruited muscle to high overall mechanical tension. To create high overall mechanical tension, we'd want to recruit as many muscle fibers as possible and have those individual fibers produce high respective forces for a decent duration. This is simply done by training to or close to failure within the 6 to 35 rep range. Reps on the lowest side of this will readily involve high muscle fiber recruitment and forces, and these increase even more as you near failure. Reps on the higher side of this only initially require low muscle fiber recruitment, but the key point is as you continue repping out and nearing failure, fiber recruitment and forces increase significantly, so much so that during those few reps before failure, fiber recruitment and forces and the duration of this high overall tension end up being comparable between lower and higher reps. Some may be wondering about reps below 6 or above 35. Reps below 6 will involve high fiber recruitment and forces, but the duration of this tension exposure is probably too short to optimally stimulate hypertrophy. Reps above 35 might generate too much central nervous system fatigue that reduces your ability to recruit muscle fibers and therefore expose them to tension. Anyway, getting to or near to failure within the 6 to 35 rep range can theoretically be done with all the training modalities, indicating that neither has an inherent superiority for eliciting high mechanical tension. Using our example, we know there are barbell, dumbbell, machine, bodyweight, and resistance bands exercises that involve elbow flexion. If you can get all of these to or near to failure in the 6 to 35 rep range, it is more than likely all of them expose the biceps to comparably high overall mechanical tension levels. Now, there is a potential problem with resistance bands specifically. We'll address this point a little later. Summarizing this section, the primary hypertrophy stimulus is likely mechanical tension, and all exercise modalities have the capacity to generate similar mechanical tension. So far, we've been discussing mechanical tension in relation to the active forces produced by muscle fibers. That's the forces generated by the actual contractile units within muscle fibers. Yet, muscle fibers and the surrounding extracellular matrix can generate forces when stretched. These are passive forces, and these forces can also be detected by mechanosensors that go on to signal muscle growth. Exercises that involve a stretch, since they would involve both active and passive forces, probably involve higher overall net mechanical tension. This logic is a strong candidate as to why the research consistently finds exercises that train muscles at stretched positions produces more hypertrophy. Barbells, dumbbells, machines, bodyweight, and resistance bands can all theoretically attain stretch. For example, the quadriceps muscles all have leverage for knee extension and would be stretched when the knees are flexed. Barbell back squats, Bulgarian split squats, hack squats, pistol squats, and resistance banded squats would all attain stretch of the quadriceps. Again, provided you can get to or near to failure within the 6 to 35 rep range with these, presumably they would be similarly effective for stimulating muscle hypertrophy. However, there again is a potential problem with resistance bands. They actually change the resistance curve of a squat, and this may be unfavorable for hypertrophy. We'll address this more later. Nevertheless, the summary of this section is neither training modality is intrinsically superior for training muscles at stretched positions. So from an overall stimulus perspective, it's evident there is no clear winner. Despite this, some may counter this with other data. Some suggest free weights produce greater increases in anabolic hormones. However, others may note that machines can provide variable resistance and overloaded eccentrics. Let's assess if these arguments have any real validity. Free weights tend to produce higher temporary increases in anabolic hormones. For example, a 2020 Canadian study compared a free weight to machine training session and found temporary increases in free testosterone were larger after the free weight session. Another 2013 study from the USA compared performing barbell squats to leg presses and found temporary increases in testosterone and growth hormone were superior after the barbell squats. Therefore, surely these greater temporary anabolic hormone increases with free weights translates into greater muscle growth signaling. They don't. A substantial number of studies simply fail to find that greater temporary elevations in anabolic hormones results in more long-term hypertrophy. It's quite possible that temporary elevations in anabolic hormones from training is a result of energy usage, not signaling muscle growth. Some say free weight training leads to chronic increases in resting testosterone, and this means more hypertrophy. For example, people have said barbell squats increase testosterone and therefore benefit overall muscle hypertrophy. The problem is many studies find free weight training, including barbell squats, largely doesn't chronically increase resting testosterone levels. We've analyzed the data in a previous video. Certain machines can provide variable resistance or eccentric overload, but does this matter? Examining variable resistance first, what actually is it? Many exercises don't equally challenge the muscle throughout the range of motion. A barbell biceps curl is hardest at the midpoint of the movement, but easier at the bottom and top portions. Machines with variable resistance vary the resistance throughout the range of motion, resulting in the muscle being challenged equally throughout the range of motion. As a fun fact, Nautilus machines were popular from the 1970s onwards, and these provided variable resistance. Arthur Jones, the founder of Nautilus, believed variable resistance was more effective. Arthur Jones was also one of the early promoters of high-intensity training. That's one set to failure. Disclaimer: in theory, it may be possible to produce variable resistance with things other than machines, but all the studies exploring variable resistance used machines. So, is variable resistance training superior? A 2013 Finnish study had trained men perform leg presses, leg extensions, and leg curls with either variable or standard resistance. Vastus lateralis gains were comparable between the standard and variable resistance groups. Another 2013 Finnish study found the exact same thing in a group of previously untrained older men. A 2019 Polish study found when training preacher curls with these variables, arm circumference gains did not differ between using variable or standard resistance. Finally, a 1995 Canadian study compared variable to standard preacher curls, and bicep gains were similar between the two. So all these studies fail to find variable resistance is more effective. I think it's probably the case regardless of whether you're using variable resistance or not. Getting to or near failure ensures sufficiently high mechanical tension. What about machines that provide eccentric overload, like flywheels? Firstly though, what is eccentric overload? Muscles are a lot stronger when producing force while lengthening versus when producing force while shortening. Case in point, when training with normal bicep curls, it requires more effort to lift than it does to lower. Machines providing eccentric overload increase the load in the eccentric portion and return to normal load in the concentric portion. Disclaimer: eccentric overload can be performed without machines, using stuff like weight releases, but all of the current studies I'm aware of evaluating eccentric overload training use flywheels or other machines. There are 11 of these studies, and only 4 of them suggest eccentric overload produced more hypertrophy versus normal training. The rest indicate similar muscle hypertrophy between eccentric and normal training. So the evidence is not compelling that eccentric overload is better for muscle hypertrophy. Some may be thinking surely eccentric overload, since it would produce greater muscle fiber recruitment during the eccentric, should add to the overall mechanical tension and thereby produce more muscle hypertrophy. But as analysed by Chris Beardsley, differential fatigue mechanisms could reconcile this. When compared to normal training, eccentric overload training may involve disproportionately more fatigue that impairs the active forces generated by muscle fibers. This potential lowered active forces with eccentric overload training may mean it does not involve more overall mechanical tension versus normal training, maybe explaining why most studies find similar hypertrophy between normal and eccentric overloaded training. Based on everything outlined so far, it's evident there isn't an inherent superior training modality, so we'd expect the research comparing hypertrophy between training modalities to largely find comparable hypertrophy. Indeed, this seems to be the case. A 2020 Belgian study had previously untrained individuals train either a freeweight only, machine only, or a combined freeweight and machine program. Each exercise was trained with the following variables. Chest, thigh, and upper arm circumference increases were comparable between all 3 groups. Criticisms of this study are untrained individuals were used, and circumference is far from the most precise measurement of muscle gains. Fortunately, another 2020 Canadian study recruited trained men and women and assessed hypertrophy with ultrasound, a much better measurement. Subjects either trained a freeweight or machine-only program. Biceps and quadriceps growth were ultimately similar between both programs. With bodyweight training, there have been 2 studies comparing it to freeweights. A 2017 Japanese study, in trained men, compared high-rep bench press training to high-rep push-up training, and chest and triceps hypertrophy were similar between both. Some may suggest the use of high reps in this study is a limitation, but we've already mentioned how high reps are no less effective than lower reps for hypertrophy, so it's not a limitation in my view. Another 2018 USA study, in men with some training experience, compared low-rep bench press to low-rep push-up training. The low reps with the push-ups were achieved by using harder push-up variations. Neither group experienced statistically significant chest gains, but both groups saw numerical increases. Fascinatingly, the percentages actually favored push-up training. But this study was only 4 weeks, and the greater percentage gains with the push-ups could be due to random variation. At the least, this study demonstrates barbells are not inherently superior to other training modalities like bodyweight. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any studies comparing muscle hypertrophy between resistance-banded training and other modalities, but as alluded to, we'll discuss some potential issues with resistance band shortly. Nevertheless, combining this long-term data with other logic and research outlined previously, I believe the argument that no training modality is inherently superior for muscle hypertrophy is strengthened. At the House of Hypertrophy, I don't accept many sponsors as I don't believe in or know the companies reaching out, but I've been in contact with Alpha Progression, a truly excellent fitness app. Most fitness apps are basic and virtually the same. Alpha Progression provides unique and more advanced features without being overwhelming. With a clean, elegant and simple design, the app provides a database of more than 450 exercises with excellent video and text tutorials on each. You can input your own training program, or use their customized workout generator that sincerely generates great programs. In either case, there are options to periodize the number of reps in reserve you leave, as well as the number of sets performed. They also provide an option to generate deload weeks. The customized workouts are still editable, allowing you to make any changes you desire. You can track your workout live, set to set. Across your training sessions, the app provides great progression recommendations to elicit progressive overload. The app also provides sleek graphs that track virtually any measurement, like your barbell bench press strength across time, the number of workouts each week, your body weight, and even the number of sets per muscle group and circumference measures of various body parts. I genuinely believe the app is fantastic, and the reviews of the app echo this. 4.9 stars on Google Play and 4.8 stars on Apple Store. If you're interested, you can get the app from the link in the comments or description. By using this link, you'll get 2 weeks completely free of all its features, plus 20% off a yearly or monthly subscription. I want to mention that if you do end up purchasing the app from this link, I will get 50% off the purchase, so this will truly help and support these free videos at the House of Hypertrophy. Thank you. In the previously mentioned studies, there weren't any that directly compared dumbbell-only training to other training modalities, but some may speculate dumbbells could be superior. Compared to barbells, machines, bodyweight, and resistance bands, dumbbells enable the greatest freedom of movement. So in certain cases, dumbbells may allow you to better carry out a movement a muscle has leverage for. For example, a dumbbell bench press permits slightly more horizontal flexion versus corresponding barbell machine and bodyweight movements. The chest has great leverage for horizontal flexion, so maybe dumbbell bench presses produce greater chest hypertrophy. Some EMG analyses, but not all, find the dumbbell bench press produces higher chest activation versus barbell bench presses. Dumbbells may also allow you to achieve a greater stretch. I'm actually skeptical that these points matter that much. Firstly, EMG simply has an array of limitations. It doesn't truly measure muscle activation. Rather, it estimates electrical signal input to the muscle's fibers, called neuromuscular excitation. Even when actual muscle activation or neuromuscular excitation is kept the same, merely changing the length of the muscle produces different EMG recordings. This is a big limitation of EMG. Cases exist where EMG data fails to translate to muscle growth. Compare a leg extension held isometrically at a short or long muscle length. EMG data finds higher quadriceps EMG recordings from leg extensions held isometrically at a short length. Yet, research actually measuring muscle growth finds leg extensions held isometrically at long lengths produce notably more quadriceps hypertrophy versus the short length. With dumbbell bench presses enabling more horizontal flexion, I'm unsure if the ability to move the dumbbells towards each other at the top adds anything extra for hypertrophy, since tension at the top is low and the muscle is at a shortened position. Some data indicate extra range of motion with the muscle shortened doesn't create more hypertrophy. With stretch, we know that it's important for hypertrophy, but I've yet to mention more stretch doesn't necessarily mean more hypertrophy. A 2019 Japanese study found similar quadriceps hypertrophy between a 90 and 140 degree knee flexion squat, despite the latter involving a greater quad stretch. There could be a threshold to the amount of passive tension that triggers hypertrophy, so I'm not currently convinced dumbbells could be superior due to slightly more motion or stretch. Hopefully we get future research directly comparing muscle growth between dumbbells and other training modalities. So the current data indicates neither training modality has an inherent superiority for muscle hypertrophy, but nuances do exist. Different modalities may involve slightly differing stabilization or biomechanics, and this may subtly impact muscle recruitment. Generally, extreme instability is going to be unfavorable for muscle hypertrophy, since stability, not the fatigue of the muscle, would be the limiting factor. Your typical exercises with different training modalities are fairly stable exercises, but subtle stability differences can exist between training modalities. Let's compare barbell and dumbbell bench presses again. Both involve horizontal flexion, shoulder flexion, and elbow extension, but the dumbbell provides comparatively more instability. This instability might actually produce greater biceps recruitment due to greater antagonistic co-activation, which fundamentally limits triceps force output. On top of this, The barbell bench press actually involves lateral forces, and these lateral forces probably enhance triceps recruitment with the barbell bench press. With the dumbbell bench press, meaningful lateral forces cannot be applied, since attempting to do so would result in you throwing the dumbbells either side of you. So although barbell and dumbbell bench presses involve horizontal flexion, shoulder flexion, and elbow extension, stability and biomechanical factors probably mean dumbbells involve lower triceps involvement. This lower triceps recruitment with the dumbbell variation could be useful or unideal depending on your goals. Note: neutral hand dumbbell bench presses likely train the triceps well, as there is research on this exercise finding it did induce notable triceps hypertrophy. When comparing a bodyweight exercise like the push-up to dumbbell or barbell bench presses, the push-up requires greater core stabilization, so it likely recruits the abdominal muscles more. Additionally, push-ups can involve scapular protraction, which results in greater serratus anterior recruitment. This higher abdominal and serratus anterior recruitment with push-ups could be useful or unideal depending on your goals. Comparing barbell back squats to Bulgarian split squats, or even hack squats, all involve hip and knee extension. However, barbell squats require you to load and stabilize the spine, likely resulting in greater spinal erector recruitment. This could be ideal or unideal depending on your goals. So summarizing this section, although no training modality is likely inherently superior for muscle hypertrophy, certain stability and biomechanical differences between modalities can subtly impact hypertrophy outcomes. Training with different exercise modalities can be complementary in an overall training program. We know, according to the principle of neuromechanical matching, muscles are recruited based on their leverage for a given movement. We also know different training modalities can involve the same movements. But this isn't actually always the case. It's impossible to carry out a vertical pull with a dumbbell or barbell. Bodyweight to machine or even resistance bands can do this. It's probably a great idea to have a vertical pulling movement in a program for back hypertrophy, so dumbbell or barbell only programs can be suboptimal. To optimally train the rectus femoris part of the quadriceps, you likely want isolated knee extension. This cannot be done effectively with barbell or dumbbell movements, and bodyweight or machine exercises are needed. Barbells and dumbbells don't really isolate knee flexion either. Bodyweight and machines can do this. It's probably favorable to have a knee flexion exercise to optimally develop the hamstring muscle group. Coming soon to the House of Hypertrophy YouTube channel, we'll be releasing free Ultimate Guide videos on developing each major muscle. These videos will provide great insight into what precise movements and exercises may be favorable. So summarizing this section, different training modalities can be complementary in an overall training program. We should not view them as an either-or. Bodyweight training and resistance bands may have problems with progressive overload. Progressive overload is fundamental for gaining muscle hypertrophy and strength long term. Two popular ways to progressive overload are increasing load or the number of reps you perform. Thinking of progressive overload as a cycle works well. A challenging training session evokes muscle and strength gains. These gains enable you to apply progressive overload, and in turn, this application of progressive overload sustains a challenging training session. Recent research, as examined in another video, indicates that progressively overloading via increasing load or reps are largely similarly effective for muscle hypertrophy. Therefore, increasing rep numbers with bodyweight or resistance bands is perfectly fine for muscle hypertrophy. However, in the long term, increasing load is going to be required, since continually adding reps and going beyond 35 reps per set may not be ideal for hypertrophy, as we alluded to already. There are harder bodyweight variations that technically increase load, particularly with the upper body. However, progressively overloading bodyweight lower body exercise long term is more challenging and limited, and I think it's more than likely bodyweight training alone isn't going to be optimal for lower body long term hypertrophy. We've discussed these points more in a previous video. With resistance bands, you can also use bands that are technically heavier loading, but the practicality and feasibility of this long term is certainly questionable. Resistance bands also have other potential issues. It's all too easy to allow the resistance band to snap back into position during the lowering phase of an exercise, resulting in extremely little muscle loading in the lowering phase. We already know that max eccentric loading simply isn't additive for hypertrophy, but I do think some eccentric loading is needed. Resistance bands also provide resistance that results in the exercise being challenging when the muscle is more shortened than stretched. I don't think max tension during stretched positions is required for optimal hypertrophy, but you probably want decent tension at stretched positions. Sometimes resistance bands involve barely any tension at stretched positions. For these reasons, I'm skeptical resistance bands are truly on par with the other training modalities. But these are my speculations. There's no research comparing actual muscle hypertrophy between resistance bands and other training modalities. There's only mixed electromyography research with some indicating similar EMG recordings between resistance bands and free weights, and others suggesting higher EMG recordings with free weights. But we've already mentioned how EMG has an array of limitations that severely limit its usefulness in comparing the muscle growth potential between different things. This isn't to say resistance bands build no muscle, of course. There was this one 2020 Japanese study indicating resistance banded curls and extensions did produce measurable biceps and triceps hypertrophy. We've already noted how if different modalities involve the same movements, taking them to or close to failure within the 6 to 35 rep range should be similarly effective for hypertrophy. Yet, some individuals may prefer a certain training modality for carrying out a given movement. For example, both Bulgarian split squats and barbell back squats involve knee and hip extension, but maybe you find the Bulgarian split squat more comfortable. Certain exercises with a training modality, like machines and resistance bands, can involve lower joint loading, and maybe this is favorable in certain circumstances. Yet, the restricted nature of certain machines may not suit your anatomy. Finally, you may have quite significant imbalances between your two limbs, and during a bilateral exercise, one side of your body may be performing disproportionately more work. This can be unideal, and dumbbell training can be a potential solution here. So summarizing this section, certain individual factors can play a role in deciding whether you want to train with barbells, dumbbells, machines, bodyweight, or even resistance bands. Neither exercise modality is inherently superior for hypertrophy. All can theoretically involve high mechanical tension, which has been identified to be the primary stimulus for hypertrophy. Greater temporary anabolic hormone increases with free weights are not associated with more hypertrophy. Machines that provide variable or eccentric overload don't seem to produce more hypertrophy. Though, subtle differences in hypertrophy can exist between training modalities due to different stability or biomechanical demands. Ultimately, different training modalities can be complementary in an overall program. Resistance bands have potential pitfalls. Namely, they can involve low tension in the lowering phase, and some resistance banded exercises barely apply tension to the muscle at stretched positions. Furthermore, progressively overloading resistance banded exercises long term, as well as bodyweight lower exercises, can be difficult to effectively achieve. If you've made it here, I have a free ebook you might like. The Ultimate Guide to Bench Pressing for Strength and Hypertrophy, with more than 100 scientific references. From technique to training variables to comparisons and other fascinating science, we cover it all. Grab it through the link in the description or comments.